Hi, cultural geography students. Welcome to another week of fun lessons in cultural geography. I think that we are really going to be getting into some good thought processes going on here because by this point in the semester, we've got a lot of our basic just knowledge and understanding about the way cultural geography ticks. We've got that behind us, and now we can start analyzing things a little bit more and asking more about why of where when we are discussing our different topics. Okay, so today we're still going to be talking about migration, which in the 12th edition is chapter 3. We're also going to be talking about some of the concepts from the urban geography chapter. Not very many, just some of them at the very beginning when it talks about the first urban revolution. We've got lots of revolutions going on that we study in this class. So we're going to talk about the first urban revolution this week. And urban geography in the 12th edition of our textbook is chapter 9. It's probably the same chapter number for the 11th edition if you have that one, but we're also going to be talking still about our agriculture chapter and also industrialization, because remember, the second agricultural revolution came about when the industrial revolution took off, and through the industrial revolution, urbanization happened, and that's going to be a really big factor that we can apply to our concepts of migration patterns. And you already saw some of that in a previous week when we watched a documentary from the library databases that talked about India and the gateway of India and the push and pull factors from rural areas to that great big city, Mumbai. So you've already seen some of this, but we're getting into kind of the weeds of what causes it. So in our last video, or one of the last videos we had together, we learned about push and pull factors for migration patterns. And today, or this week and next, we're going to be getting into more modern times, but and looking at the way that people use migration as a method for social uplift. So there's a lot of pull factors that make people choose the places that they immigrate with an I, they immigrate into, okay? So there could be economic reasons, like there's not jobs or opportunities, and or there could be like infrastructure reasons. Now I don't have that word on the board here, infrastructure, but that is a major topic that we're going to look at with urbanization, and also the difference in stages of development. You've heard first world, second world, and third world, or the developed world, developing, underdeveloped world, these kinds of classifications of people. It has to do, of countries really, it has to do a lot with what we call infrastructure, that we are going to be looking at this concept carefully this week and next, maybe more in depth next week, but it has a lot, it's linked to urbanization quite a lot. Okay, so urbanization occurred in conjunction with the Industrial Revolution. Urbanization occurred not only because factories were built in cultural hearths, which you'll read about in chapter 9 in urban geography. There are many different cultural hearths, urbanized hearths around the world, and they coincide with those agricultural hearths that we can look at on the map. Peru, Mesopotamia, the Nile River Valley, etc. These are places where urbanization and city building really happened for the first time. So during subsistence agriculture, we had agricultural villages that really had more of a communal kind of nature. The culture was very small, very homogeneous. People willingly participated in that together. But the industrialization process, the urbanization process, the for-profit food production process that came as a result really changed that cultural mindset, the cultural landscape, and our mental scapes about participation with each other. We've already talked about how land ownership really created, and then profit derived from that land or derived from those factories. That really created vast differences among us. Wealth and poverty are not the only thing, but also gender differences. We haven't really talked yet about gender roles in this class. We will, maybe next next week, but that's another push and pull factor that you will see. Some people opt to leave because of, opt to leave one place. They immigrate with an E from one place into other places where there is greater equality among the sexes, for instance. So in stage 4 of the demographic transition model, where you see populations are high, but they're kind of stabilized, and they're not necessarily just skyrocketing up like you saw that happen in stage 3 of demographic transition. But in stage 4, you have elevated status of women, it says in our textbook, which we will look at that a little bit more in depth. We've already looked at some of the issues of social equality, from subsistence agriculture to other, to the industrialized agriculture that happened with the second agricultural revolution. But with the second agricultural revolution, urbanization happened. The first urban revolution occurred. And that is the process of building cities because people need the goods and services, because people need to live close by where the economic center is. And these hearths of urbanization occurred where already the exchange places, the places where transportation, why were they where? It's because they were places where transportation was easily done. It was a crossroads. It was the Spice Road, for instance, that you will read about in history, or it was it was adjacent to a place that had a great fertile land, like like in Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and those rivers are transportation centers. So these are the why of where answers to those places that are cited in chapter 9 as those urban hearths. Where did they begin? And you can flip over to chapter 12 or chapter 11, whatever the number is for the agriculture chapter, and look at that beautiful 2-page map that shows you what crops were grown in what places. And please notice the parallels. Please notice the overlaps of these urban cultural hearths to those agricultural hearths that are cited in chapter 11. Okay, so urbanization means to build cities, but it's not just about the infrastructure, the buildings themselves, the roads, bridges, water resources, that would be plumbed water resources, or even wells that are available for people to go and collect and manually transport water. Also, sewage systems, waste management systems. These are some major issues that early urbanized areas did not necessarily take into their city planning when these cities were being built. And since the urban centers had such an economic pull from the hinterland or from the rural areas of a place, typically more people flooded into these city areas than there were accommodations for those people initially. So that's where the infrastructure comes in, with people flocking to cities because the jobs are there, because opportunity is there, because education is there, because maybe better living conditions in our minds, better living conditions exist there potentially. But early on, there were not these very well thought out cities necessarily that were being built up around these agricultural hearths. So we went from agricultural village to city, of course, like you might see in, a biblical movie or something. Like I watch Moses every year when Easter rolls around. They'll have the Ten Commandments on TV, and you can clearly see that those are big cities. But those cities are not what we're talking about in the first urban revolution. Those cities existed as central ports on the Mediterranean Sea, for instance, or on the Nile River. These were central places where people could bring their crops, people could bring their products and sell to really a localized community. The city itself was sort of the governmental center, the economic center, the education center, the high culture or religious center for an area, and the hinterland, the peripheral and the semi-peripheral zones around that city. We'll talk about where those words peripheral and semi-peripheral come from in a future lecture also. But the zones around that were not really incorporated into a governmental system, but the city had the government and the control over the regions around it. And so you might remember a word called city-state that perhaps you studied in a political science class or maybe a history class if you've taken a world civilizations overview. A city-state is an early governmental structure where the city itself, that was the power center, the economic center, the religious center, all of those things I just mentioned, had control over the peripheral land around it, and then farther out, the semi-peripheral land around that. And all of those people, in order to have any sort of economic benefit or uplift or not be isolated, had to look to that city in order for the core governance, the core economic and social and political and educational examples for that exterior. And so urbanization occurred very rapidly during the Industrial Revolution, and infrastructure was built to try to keep up with the people who flocked to those cities for the perceived pull factors that those cities offered. So we will look more in depth at this urbanization process. What is infrastructure? We will tie in push and pull factors again into this, and we'll even talk about some additional forms of migration. For instance, we haven't mentioned chain migration yet. Look that one up, please. But if you Google it, be careful with your results because it's a political term right now, a hotly contested political term right now. We just need to look at the cultural geography basic definition of chain migration in order to understand what the definition of it is without any kind of political controversy overlapped to it. So be careful what you're Googling if you try to Google the word chain migration. But we will talk about these topics this week and also next week as we get into this concept of the developed world presently compared to the underdeveloped or developing world and the style of life that people have there. This is cultural geography. Our textbook is called Human Geography. We want to know about the you and me experience that the macro scale social structure creates. And why of where do we go in the world? Why are things built? And that kind of thing. Okay, see you next time.